the British newspaper The Guardian published a front page article about sociologists. The headline, the title for this second section of The Guardian was "Who Needs Sociologists?" Okay. And well, there was an editorial and a discussion about the sociologists linked to the crisis in the universities, in the British universities. But to a certain extent, it responds to filling in certain circles, certain areas of the society, certain groups, about that sociology is doing nothing important in societies. Thinking about the possible roles of sociologists, I would like to propose you two dichotomic metaphors for our discussion this morning. That are possible roles, possible alternative for our role as sociologists in society. The first dichotomy is linked, is connected regarding to action or possible action. We can see that we are the registers, the recorders of society. We describe society, we have observations about the society. At a certain extent, we are accounts of the society in a moment, in a time, and in a space. As registers, as recorder, we can have at least two possible ways, and this is the way that we normally make observations in society. One is more qualitative, and is continue with the metaphor, is we produce something like the books of travelers, the travelers that go to societies and produce some books in the tradition of the humanities, observations, interpretation of the societies. But the difference is we are traveling in our own societies, but it's an approach. The second possible metaphor is that we are bookkeepers. In this case, we are not accounting for some descriptions, quantification of society. We are the bookkeepers about poverty, groups, classes, but we are accounting a description of society. This is a possible approach. And the other extreme of this dichotomous processes, I will put the politics. There is not description, is the need of intervention in society. And I call politics with capitals in order to include several possible alternatives. We can say social workers is a kind of intervention. That is, people that are trying to do some knowledge and work, and who are to a certain extent social workers. There are people who is more working in social engineers than trying to modify a society, or more politics that are revolutionary. And it was discussed a lot in third world countries and Latin America about the engagement, the compromis, the sociologue that is intervening in society, and there is a link to all this discussion about well, the Weber article about the links with the scientists and the politics and the possible roles of that. To a certain extent, the first role is linked to the question: how is the society? How we can describe the society? The second role is linked to how can we change the society? How we can reform the society? The second dichotomy is linked to time. I see in one side the role of sociology as the coroner, the pathologists, the judicial pathologists, who observed society, to observe the person who has died already, to observe the scene that has happened, and try to explain that. This is the position of methodological individualism. Is nothing to explain before, we just see what has happened and try to explain after, post festum, what's happening in that society, and try to make different kind of interpretation theories. And on the other hand, on the other extreme of this dichotomous process, I will put as metaphor the prophets. The prophets. The sociology tried to foresee what is going to happen in societies. You know? We try to make this could have different positions. The futurologist was for years a possible profession, even futurologists, people who works in the projection of the future, try to imagine. That is linked sometimes to science, but probably science fiction more than science. But society asks to sociologists, try to see in advance what is going to happen with some process. We know that to a certain extent we can foresee some process as projection, but on the other hand we know also that there are some amount of perverse effects, undesired effects in society that we cannot foresee, and that the future is at the end something that is linked to the past, or as Hegel said, the opposite. Probably the future is the cause that we are going to organize, but it's for our action today, not for. So, what I would like to propose to you is this different roles to see what is possible to do and what is possible to choose. Perhaps the feeling that the Guardian showed in that line is linked to a demand of the society that sometimes we cannot fulfill, and what I'm not sure is to what extent we are not able to fulfill because our science is not yet developed to do that, or some kind of activity or some kind of behavior as sociology. Some years ago, 5-6 years ago, I was working for the World Health Organization in a program, was the chair of an advisory panel there, and there was a program to control onchocercosis in Central Africa. Onchocercosis is river blindness disease. It's a terrible disease, la maladie de Zabek, de rivière, and there is a drug that is distributed and shipped free of charge for the countries. It's, for whatever the reason is, Merck Sharp and Dohme distributed it free of charge for the countries. And there was a problem in distribution. The head of the regional office was presented all the program, and was in the advisory panel, and I suggested a sociologist, because I thought at that moment that a sociologist would be very important. He was completely against the idea, but strongly against the idea. He didn't know that I was a sociologist, because I was in the WHO, and at that time I don't use long hair, so I looked like a medical doctor's normal. and saying no, completely no, was completely strong, was not possible at all. And he told us about an experience about a sociologist that he had in the team in Central Africa. Well, 2 years later, more or less 2 years later, I met that sociologist in a meeting, and I tried to discuss with him and to see what had happened with the program and that. I should confess that I agree with the medical doctor. Because this is a kind of dilettantism. You know? Plenty of big theories. There's a person that really create problems and never solve one. And they're trying and they meet and they require sociologists that could help them how to distribute a drug that is free of charge for poor population living in the rivers inside of all that area. I think that we have to produce, at least my opinion, some knowledge, and we have to teach some behavior that could help society to change in different ways. Could be revolutionary, could be in some applied, but to a certain extent the role of sociology is to transform the society. That's all idea of Marx, that science should transform society, that really is in our profession. And if not as sociologists, as citizens, we have some knowledge and we have the responsibility of use that for reform, as Janet said, just the word, to change the words, to use for better society. And if we are the people who really knows about the society, we have the first responsibility to help the world and have a better society. That is my remarks.
Okay. Well, you've started off by posing the problem for us, and the rest of us are going to solve it. Well, yes, Janet, fine.
I talk a great deal to students, graduate students I have over the years, 45 years, trying to help them decide what role they should play. I have one rule of thumb. You find that the place that intersects between what you can do best, that is, let's assume we all have the same goal. We would like to improve the world. That's why people go into sociology. You find out what are your skills, what are the things that you do best, and intersecting that is the things that need to be done. And you work not at any particular place, but you work at the intersection. Some people are very good at grand theorizing. Some people are wonderful as neighborhood organizers. Neighborhoods need to be organized, thoughts have to be organized. I think the search for the role for the sociologist is a kind of false question. The other point is that sociologists, and again this is part of my advice, is very much like the oath that doctors take. Do no harm. I think sociology on one extreme is so ineffectual that it can't get anything done, which I think is not true. The other is the hubris to think that if we only have the right ideas and the right knowledge, that we have the power to change things. But most of us operate in the middle, where we try to affect change. But I mean, I have to come to a personal story, and that is I used to be a city planner. A city planner in the United States, and I worked with the people who designed the urban redevelopment renewal laws. They were all good people. We had very good ends. And in the process, we destroyed poor people's areas and never gave them anything. So by the time this plot became, and this is now 40 years ago, I said, I'm not going to do. I don't want to do harm. I will spend my life teaching to try to inoculate students. This is what I do best. Things need to change, but I am not either a worker in the villages, nor am I a grand theorist. Each one of us finds the role that we can play. So your dichotomies are, they're interesting, but they don't give us a prescription of where each individual sociologist, and I doubt whether we can find that.
Abdelkader?
Comme Jeannette, je vais parler d'une position particulariste et locale. C'est-à-dire, je vais essayer de parler de mon expérience dans la région arabe. Roberto a commencé par la question qui a besoin des sociologues. Je vais utiliser une autre question. Qui a peur des sociologues? Je crois que dans notre région, c'est l'une des principales questions à poser. Qui a peur des sociologues? Et pourquoi? Les sociologues sont réellement des gens dangereux. Ils sont dangereux pour les autres, ils sont dangereux pour eux-mêmes. Ils sont dangereux pour les autres parce que leur métier, le métier de sociologue, est de produire des narrations, de raconter des histoires. Vous avez dit record, tout ça, mais en réalité, ce qu'on fait, c'est on raconte une narration. On raconte une narration des conduites des autres ou des conduites des pratiques humaines qui sont des narrations et que ces narrations sont des représentations du réel, mais ce sont en même temps des actions. En tant que narration, nous représentons le réel et nous agissons sur le réel. Les agents qui sont l'objet de notre discours sont des agents qui sont susceptibles de changer leur pratique en étant influencés directement ou indirectement par notre discours. Qu'on le veuille ou non, qu'on soit, nous sommes responsables de notre action sur les représentations des autres, qu'on soit individualiste, idéologique, ou qu'on soit... Donc, nous sommes réellement dangereux pour les autres. Parce que nous agissons sur leur représentation, qu'on le veuille ou non. Et nous sommes dangereux pour nous-mêmes, parce que les sociétés, les individus, les collectivités n'acceptent pas facilement le privilège des sociologues de changer la représentation des autres. Surtout dans des sociétés où la démocratie n'est pas une production, une activité qui remonte à 3 ou 4 siècles, ou même 2 siècles, ou même et je comprends très bien que des personnes, des groupes, des communautés, des secteurs ont peur des sociologues et veulent utiliser les moyens les plus efficaces pour les éliminer. Et j'ai 3 amis algériens, 2 sociologues et 1 psychiatre, qui ont été physiquement éliminés parce qu'ils ont pris le risque, et je dis bien le risque, avant, sans savoir le danger, de vouloir changer les représentations des autres. Et beaucoup de mes amis algériens ont quitté l'Algérie, des dizaines, des centaines, des dizaines de sociologues en tout cas, des centaines d'intellectuels ont quitté l'Algérie parce que il y a un mouvement social ou des institutions qui sont conscients des dangers de ceux qui veulent raconter des histoires et qui pas simplement racontent des histoires, mais ils agissent sur la représentation des autres. Dans ce contexte-là, nous savons aussi en même temps que les sociologues, par leur formation, ont deux vocations, disons. La vocation à un discours universaliste. C'est le métier de sociologue. En général, même s'il parle sur un village, sur un quartier, sur une population délimitée, il y a toujours la vocation, la prétention à une orientation universaliste qui dépasse le particularisme local. Et en même temps, il y a le doute radical. C'est-à-dire, mais le doute radical même sur cette vocation universaliste. Le sociologue, disons l'éthique, on va appeler ça l'éthique du sociologue, c'est cette vocation universaliste et le doute radical qui distingue la narration des sociologues, sciences humaines, de la narration religieuse. La narration des grandes religions a une vocation universaliste aussi, mais elle n'a pas le doute systématique. S'il y a une distinction entre les grandes religions et les spécialistes de sciences sociales, c'est le doute systématique y compris. Et les sciences sociales, ce qu'on appelle la première discussion sur la crise, les sciences sociales, la crise c'est une dimension constitutive des sciences sociales. La science sociale ne peut pas exister s'il n'y a pas une remise en cause constante des paradigmes et des changements de ces paradigmes. Avec la vocation universaliste et le doute systématique, on devient dans une situation de confrontation directe avec tout le discours de croyance dogmatique, que ce soit religieux ou que ce soit sécularisé, laïque. Tout, on devient religieux pour toute personne qui est spécialisée dans la production d'un discours dogmatique, que ce soit un discours religieux, un discours politique, un discours laïque. La question se pose pour nous en tant que sociologues, c'est-à-dire on a le choix de l'affirmer et on peut ne rien faire et recevoir notre salaire, c'est souvent très possible. On a pour ceux qui ont certainement la possibilité de quitter le pays, de travailler à l'étranger, de plus en plus difficile. Mais si on veut pratiquer notre métier, notre rôle dans notre région, nous devons avoir... Notre métier est un métier risqué, mais réellement risqué au sens physique, intellectuel et physique du terme, et plus intellectuel, c'est-à-dire les deux, risqué. Nous sommes dans une situation de risque permanent. Les trois derniers, je vous donne rapidement trois exemples. L'organisation de la réunion de la région arabe. Emmanuel et Marie-Louise ont assisté. Le risque, c'est... On ne peut pas organiser une réunion sans argent, sans autorisation politique. Et si on veut diffuser ces valeurs de la vocation universaliste et le doute systématique, il faut un espace politique et une volonté où il y a une négociation permanente, risquée et dangereuse, et des choix à faire, accepter ou ne pas accepter, travailler à l'intérieur du pays ou travailler à l'extérieur du pays. Et ça, un exemple, j'ai pris le risque avec Ayad El-Wadani et d'autres d'organiser une réunion financée par le gouvernement tunisien avec la présentation de des fêtes et la participation de presque la moitié des participants des femmes de la première génération. Parce que l'enjeu dans notre société, ce sont les femmes. L'enjeu, ce n'est pas en tant que tel, mais l'enjeu. Elles sont l'objet d'une lutte. Et la moitié des participants étaient des femmes de la première génération. C'était un enjeu assez important. On a pris ce risque. Ça a marché avec les engagements liés à ce choix. Et c'est un choix. Deuxième expérience. Mardi prochain, il y aura à Malte une réunion méditerranéenne organisée par les fondations maltaises sur les stéréotypes. Et au départ, c'était organisé, c'est Malte qui organise. Malte a demandé à l'Association arabe de sociologie de prêter son nom comme participant parmi les autres participants. Et les Maltais, à mon avis, d'une manière maladroite, n'ont pas informé l'Association arabe de sociologie des noms des participants. Il y avait des participants israéliens. Sans que l'Association arabe de sociologie soit informée dès le départ. Bon.
La réunion se trouve où?
À Malte. À Malte. Sur les stéréotypes. C'est une réunion méditerranéenne c'est normal qu'il y a des Israéliens, mais le problème pour l'association arabe de sociologie, c'est que il y a son nom sans qu'il y a une négociation dès le départ, une information qui va participer, comment. Donc l'association, en tant qu'association, a demandé qu'on retire officiellement la caution de l'association et le nom de l'association, et que les sociologues arabes peuvent participer d'une manière individuelle, en tant que sociologue individu, pas en tant que représentant de l'association arabe de sociologie. Voilà un risque. Je vais personnellement participer à cette réunion. Je risque d'être manipulé, pas par le gouvernement tunisien, mais par des forces extérieures à mon gouvernement tunisien. Je risque d'être manipulé par des intellectuels arabes qui vont me dénoncer comme pro-sioniste et tout ça. Mais ce n'est pas très grave. Mais pour moi, ce n'est pas très grave. Mais c'est grave pour l'association arabe de sociologie. Personnellement, c'est comme disent pro-sionistes, ça n'empêche pas de dormir. Mais ça peut gêner l'association arabe de sociologie. En tant que... troisième truc très rapide. L'enjeu pour nous, comme j'ai dit, c'est de diffuser cette éthique de la vocation universaliste et des doutes systématiques. Et ceci ne peut être fait, à notre avis, à mon avis, que d'une manière comparative. Pour sortir de ghetto culturel, aussi bien occidental que non occidental, c'est de manière comparative. Et de faire participer, sortir les sociologues arabes de leur pays, et on voudrait faire, on est en train de préparer une session ad hoc, une session pour le prochain congrès, sur islam et globalisation. Globalisation et islam. Là aussi, c'est un risque. Le titre est un risque. Ceux qui vont participer officiellement, bon, on peut les connaître. Ceux qui vont assister, ceux qui vont manipuler, ceux qui vont venir. Notre métier, c'est-à-dire, et nous sommes dangereux, je répète, pas pour les autres. C'est-à-dire, c'est pas simplement pour les gens qui vont venir, on va leur changer peut-être leur représentation de la relation entre l'islam et la modernité, l'islam et la globalisation, mais on peut avoir des réactions de différentes manières qui risquent, qui nous posent dans une position de risque physique, dans cette, on ne sait pas qui va venir. On ne sait pas quelles provocations peuvent être de la salle. Mais c'est un risque que je m'arrête, je m'excuse de parler
No, but I mean, between Janet and you have posed the problem clearly, because this is what I hear. Janet says, do no harm. What does that mean? That means that she is saying that the sociology is under pressure, not from society in the abstract, but from powerful people, the powers in society, and they, in a sense, are trying to manipulate sociologists as individuals to do things which you think might be harmful. So you're saying it's a message to ourselves, be careful, there are people trying to use us in various ways and we must try not to do harm. And you are saying sociologists are dangerous because they're anti-dogmatic, because they have new ways of looking at things, because they have this universalist vocation that goes beyond the particular structures in which they find themselves. So to whom are they really dangerous? They're dangerous to the powerful people, and therefore they're repressed. You give us the Algerian example and other examples. So in both cases, you're worried about, how shall I say, the power of sociologists to do things, but their relative weakness vis-a-vis really powerful people. I mean, that's the issue in some sense that's being posed. How do we maneuver ourselves as the intellectuals which have these skills and these powers, but are certainly not as powerful as other people who control the social structures in which we live, or the states in which we live, and so forth. So we try to keep some distance from them, but we also, as you pointed out, we have to turn to them and get money from them to do X, Y, and Z, and that puts us in a position of obligation. So the issue of sociologists in society is not really the issue of the sociologist in society. It's the issue of the sociologist and the powerful, isn't it? I mean, as the issue has been posed here. Maybe that's an incorrect way to pose it, but it's been posed that way, and I invite further comments.
I want to mention this business of choice. It may be that I come from a resource-rich society, which gives me more choice. When I used to work in economic development of what was called backward countries, the old days.
That was really the old days.
Really, well, now we have euphemisms to cover it.
That's right.
And routinely,
we use that.
Well, you may use it, we don't use it.
Routinely, in the early days, I used to get calls from the State Department, and then they had point forward the idea of why don't you go to such and such and do a plan for them. I have a choice. I never worked for any of those institutions. In part, so I mean, it's not just a matter of doing no harm, but also making the choices, evaluating each case. That is, I could be on the demonstration lines in my neighborhood in New York. I could be, it's not that you don't take action, but the issue of choice, of when do you take action, when you evaluate each time. I'm willing to fight losing battles with great risk, and I also choose when I evaluate that I can be manipulated. My findings, we don't control our findings, so I mean we can't say we can never. If we sit at home only, then we can do no harm. But if we have findings, they can be used, they will be used, but we ought not to sell our souls for it. Okay. And perhaps if you are rich enough, you don't have to sell your soul. I'm not sure.
It's already bought.
It's laundered.
It's laundered. Okay.
The money has come from poor people, but it's gone through a number of
laundered money. Yes.
Oh, Emmanuel, I would agree with you if you change sociologists by intellectuals, because, for example,
yes, absolutely.
In Spain, there is I don't know, 50% or 60%, and it's growing, of sociology which belongs to the status quo, and which does a lot of harm. So I remember, Janet, that you said yesterday that we belong to a marginalized part of sociology. You have an increasingly important sociology which defines itself as something like social engineering, and which doesn't ask itself all these moral or ethical normative questions.
Well, maybe it does. Maybe they just have different moralities and different norms.
One more point is that these, at least in the case of Spain, which until now the universities, state universities, our private universities are very small and dominated by the church until now, our students have changed. You can see it physically during the last 20 years, if you want. We always have in each group, I don't know, 10-15% of the old people who want to study social sciences because they have some, questions about things are going wrong, and we have increasingly little technocrats with 18-20 years, and it's just...
Ari?
Yeah. Difficult topic this, but let me try my best. There is a conception that comes from, I suppose, historical materialism, Marxism, Gandhianism, Gramsci, and so on, that about theory and practice. Although there are intellectuals out there, there is this citadel of reason that would capture, in a sense, the theory which would define the correct practice, and then, it is executed. The individuals out there in movements, in parties, do it. That conception of, basically, for Gramsci, the modern prince, and so on, I think has been under crisis for some time now. There is no modern prince. There is all-seeing party. There is no overseeing accountability. And it creates some problems. Now, the first problem is that people fall into the trap of the old paradigm that says sociologist is a professional, leave the work to professional politicians. It's the professionalization of everything, including social practice and social engineers and so on. And if trade unions and women's organizers need professionals, they must hire professionals and leave, sociologists back to your desks, which is a very powerful argument. Second observation is that through that absence of, or the crisis of those ideas, we have seen a proliferation, especially for instance in Southern Africa, where there's such many just causes, of all kinds of activists, sociologists, who, in a sense, through the argument that sociology should be engagé, should be normative, should be committed, run around and cause all kinds of havoc, wherever they touch, which pushes you back and say, be a good methodologist and so on, and leave politics to the community and so on. The third is the realization that knowledge is fragmenting from that citadel. It's moving out to all kinds of informal other networks. If it's correct what is happening now, there is a democratization of both the process of research and theorization or theorizing, and all kinds of people are doing that. It's only us who get promotions over that, and therefore have to conform to a new intellectual Taylorism. How many articles did you publish a year, and so on, in order to get your professional promotion. So these three things in tandem have created, I suppose, a new challenge for us, which I think can only be resolved by keeping the distinction, a distinction one of, on the one hand, you are in a vocation that involves certain degree of craft and certain degree of experience, and that makes you, in a sense, trained in a certain, whether it's qualitative training or whatever training in some area. And secondly, you're a citizen of some kind, and the two must not be confused so easily. That you should be an active citizen and act within context, accountable to the victims of your actions. And as now a craftsperson, you should have your kind of Hippocratic or hypocritic oath through which you look at your bearings about what you should be doing. I think in the South, from the Southern perspective, we do not need many more engagé social scientists. There is enough engagement that is happening. And the role of the social scientist is more of a facilitating resource for social action, if at best.
The question is, of course, whether there's any way of not being engagé, whether when you're being the facilitating social scientist, you're not, in fact, got a hidden commitment.
Yes, sure. I agree with that, but it's not. It takes it away from the old.
It's not going down in the street with the picket sign. It's true. It's another way of being engaged, but it may be as politically committed.
Yes,
that becomes hypocritical, because when you are down on the street, you are also doing observations.
Well, no, it's the other way around. When you're not down on the street, you're also being politically engaged, because by the nature of your research and the choice of your problems and the
all marginal.
No, we're not all marginal. We're all involved. That's different. Heinz.
Well, before I go to the point I would like to make, I comment on what James said. It's a question of choice, that's true. But anyway, when you have published your findings, it's out of your hands. There's no choice anymore. Because I remember having read a lot of years ago political fiction book on a department of the CIA which was located in New York, where a lot of intellectuals were working, 300, 400, I don't remember, which had the only function to read everything what was coming out of the different sociological, economic, anthropological, historical publications, and to translate this in inputs for the action of the CIA. I don't believe in conspiracy theories, but this is what happens with.
Anyway, it's a very good idea.
What can happen with our work? What can happen with our work? But I wanted to go to a different point, which has a lot to do with what Karel said. I would like to go to with the permission of Beatrice, to the borderline.
Yes.
I will take 3 examples following the didactical proposition implicit in Abdelkader's contribution. First, Chile, round about the end of 1972, the beginning of 1973. There was a popular government which tried to develop democratic socialism and had a popular base for it. The intellectuals, the social scientists, were extremely divided. There were two clearly divided camps. One group said, we have to radicalize the process. The only way to go ahead is to radicalize the process. The other group said, we have to work together with the government to accept what the Communist Party was saying, that is, to be more or less, to be less radical and to do work within the framework of what was possible for the Communist Party. The war between the two camps was absolute. They wrote articles against each other. Well, on September 11, 1973, there was a military coup. Sociology was prohibited, history was prohibited, psychology was prohibited. The only thing what overlived was economics. First point. Second point. In the 80s, as you know, as in other countries of the Third World, the IMF and the World Bank, with active support of our political classes and of our of our bourgeoisie, institutionalized these adjustment policies and tried later on, after having made the adjustment policies, to impose neoliberal societal models. There's quite a lot of sociologists, what Maria Lu said, there's quite a lot of sociologists, of intellectuals in general, who subscribe this model, who work actively as not even as social engineers, but even as a kind of public relation officers for this model. And there is a group, minor group, I agree with Maria Luz, which is trying to do what Adi proposed, to develop models of social action, which could be of some kind of resistance against what is going on. Well, it's undoubtable that what Roberto proposed should be even the Corona and even the legislators, they should be compromised with this kind of things. But there's no doubt that the other group is determining let's say the image of sociology and social sciences with the public, with the society. I don't speak of civil society, but with the society as a general. And that the legitimation for social sciences comes from there and not from us. And I think this is another borderline situation, which is very brave. I go to my third example. I will be very short about that. Cuba. Cuba, 1995, 1996. I was there in December of 1994. I met a lot of friends of mine who were working actively with the government. And I met some friends of mine who were taking distance to what the government was making and the Communist Party was making. What is your So that's why I talked about borderline. What is your paper? What is your role as sociologist, as intellectual, in a situation of as Cuba 1990 till now? What is really the choice you can make? Raúl Castro, some 6 months ago, made a speech, and he eventually dissolved all the more or less independent research centers which survived. There was no protest, not even from the intellectuals in Latin America, which are identified with the neoliberal model. Not even from them. There was no protest. Borderline. The choice. Where are we? This is what I would like to reflect, and I think we have to live with the contradictions. We have to live intellectually and existentially within these contradictions involved in the borderline situation, in which we always are, in which we eventually always are, everybody of us, every day, in his practice as social scientist, as intellectual.
Arthur.
Well, I think all the discussions are adding up or accumulating or elaborating on very key issues. I just want to briefly share, the way these dilemmas were faced by me as from a young social scientist till date, and particularly as a student of social movements, and that also a variety of movements. If you are studying the Gandhian movement, let us say the Gramdan movement, which I did in the earlier stages, you again had the problem of those who were against the movement, movements and counter-movements. Subsequently, when I studied the Marxist-Leninist movement, it again had its own complexion of how do you relate, how do you equate, and where do you go. Then when it came to farmers' movement, vis-a-vis labor, let us say, which is another very important dimension of contradiction between the farmer and the labor. How do you relate? How do you go about? So in a variety of situations, as a student of social movements, I have felt that there is probably a way in which you have to define yourself if you have to get the best yield. And it seems to me that there are, and this is more or less an echo of what Ari says and what has been reflected. One is, I think the role as an academic or an intellectual, as a knowledge producer, is, I think, the most important part of the role that the sociologist or the social scientist has to play. He has to be true to the knowledge that he feels competent of producing, and the issues and the problematic which he is entering into. And that somehow should not be contaminated. I think that is the first most important thing that one has to do. Now, in order to do that, you come into these difficulties. One is, if you are part of the praxis, then you produce more authentic knowledge. If you are not, then you have problem. You have all kinds of debates that go on. It seems to me there again, depending upon one's value commitments and the perspective in which, and there are value commitments or value bases of any social scientist, implicit or explicit, one has to go about in a discerning manner as to where does one structurally locate oneself. And it may be, you may be a part of a change promoter, or you may be a part of a change resistor. It depends upon the context, whether from the point of view of your value commitments, a change is desirable or a change should be resisted. Now, for instance, when the emergency came in India, it was something that had to be resisted, not to be promoted. So you took up a role of that order. And thirdly, I think, as what Ari again says, is the level of the citizen. You have certain fundamental, probably, obligations as a citizen, certain norms that The third thing is in terms of where does one pitch also depends upon the kind and quality of change. I mean, one is, where you probably more at the level of being consulted on how to bring about city planning. At another level, you may be asked, look, I can't find any more contradictions, as the leader of the Naxalite movement at one stage says in North Bengal. I mean, I can't mobilize anymore. And then it's not advice that I'm giving, but it's advice that is sought. You have studied this area. You have studied the contradictions. You know the basic theories on which we have moved with tactics. We are now failing to mobilize. What is happening? Now, it's not that one is giving an advice to the leader as to how he should go about himself, but certainly one then starts sharing that, look, you shouldn't look for contradictions where you were looking for it yesterday, because they have changed. And then there is a dialogue or a discussion by which there is either appreciation or agreement or disagreement. I think this becomes a role of the sociologist as well. Not an unsolicited advice, but an advice or a dialogue which is sought. And then it becomes perhaps of some value, and where one doesn't press into the point so much. The third point about activism is something which we always encounter both with my colleagues and students. I more or less would agree with Aritas from our experience that once one gets into an activist mode with reference to a particular group to which it is committed, it becomes very difficult to extricate oneself out of the strategies and tactics which that group pursues. Suppose you come to a disagreement at some point as to, look, this is not the way to go about in terms of whatever your analysis. It's very difficult for oneself to, unless you're being branded as, you're a renegade or something. I have some of my very venerable colleagues, Professor Ranveer Singh, who was a part of a member of the CPIM, when the Punjab crisis came about, had to leave CPIM because he had to intellectually rationalize what the CPM stand was. In fact, he couldn't influence the CPM to change its views with reference to the realities, but some policies which were made elsewhere in Delhi were supposed to be rationalized by the intellectual, that this is our policy and this is right. So the role of the sociologist in terms of getting committed to a party or an activist organization has its vulnerabilities. But at any rate, I don't think there can be a golden rule about not being a part of it or being a part of it, depending upon the citizen role which comes up. For instance, as I said, when the emergency came, we were part of the movement straight away. And it was clearly, which side you are on. There's no dilemma. And therefore, finally, I think another lesson that I learned in the very early stages of my experience was this notion that I had that as a sociologist I should be really helpful and good and to people who needed it and so forth. And in one of the villages that I went to study, in the Gramdan villages, of 9 villages that I went to, there was a tremendous conflict between the poor peasant and the agricultural labor on the one hand, and the feudal landlords on the other. And there was physical oppression that was on rampant, so to the extent that I was told to be very careful about visiting the place, that you might get whacked as well and so forth. And I thought, well, I'll teach these fellows a lesson. So I went and met the district magistrate and said, this is the picture, and went and of course did the study, then came back, reported to him after getting a lot of information on what was going on. Then the district magistrate, who was also a progressive, fortunately, sent his policeman and tried to see that, as soon as the policemen withdrew, these fellows got whacked twice as much as they got earlier. And I realized that you shouldn't meddle in something where you cannot in a sustained way also take the brunt of the responsibility. So this is almost in equivalence with, in a wavelength with you, that we should be very careful about how you go out, not only in terms of your being manipulated, but in terms of unintended consequences of you trying to do good, even if perhaps that is not the case. So these are the few things I had to share. I think the sociologist's basic concern is to production of knowledge, which can itself be potentially subversive. It doesn't matter It doesn't matter. I think that is the greatest danger with social sciences. That it could be potentially subversive, but that's it. That's the marginal game.
Well, you know, part of the issue is that we live in different states at different points in time. And these states are on a continuum from being more liberal, meaning more space for diverse, publicly stated diverse opinions, and more authoritarian, meaning less space for publicly stated diverse opinions. No state is totally liberal. They tend to be the rich states with lots of resources. They tend to offer a lot of space, but not unlimited space for people. And all of us who live in such states know that the space is not unlimited. But it's probably greater than it is in Algeria or in China or even in India and so forth. So we all have to make decisions in view of the immediate consequences to us as well as the impact on society. We are all paid by somebody. And there is a certain pressure as a result of this banal economic fact that we are employed, the money comes from somewhere, it can be cut off. Furthermore, we need funds for research, and we can either get them or not get them. There are a lot of subtle and not so subtle pressures that are on us constantly. If the situation at the political moment of the time is one of acute conflict, people are in the streets, the emergency in India or the last days of the Allende regime or just before the end of apartheid in South Africa. If it's a situation of immediate acute conflict, well, then usually you have to choose sides. You're either on one side or you're on the other, and you make your decisions as your politics are. But a lot of the time, it's not a situation of immediate acute conflict. It's relatively quieter. At which point, people say to themselves, well, I could, in fact, find some space to act in a meaningful way. But I have kind of a choice at that point of where to act. And this is the constant dilemma. I can decide to act, how shall I say, within the structures of power, right? I can try to get inside them and manipulate them and so forth. This was the debate to which several of you have adverted. Or I can say, no, that's compromising. I've got to be in a movement that's somehow outside the interstices of power. You're still the same sociologist. And I don't think there's any refuge in saying at any point that we can just sort of apply our trade and we're somehow avoiding this choice. We're always choosing, and that reflects commitments. Now, sociologists tend to be, by and large, people more than other intellectuals who are committed to a more egalitarian, more just society, but certainly, as Morelos reminds us, not all sociologists, certainly not all intellectuals feel that way, but in some sense, that vocation, what is the vocation that we have? I mean, that Abdul Qadir was speaking about. Is it a vocation to the true, or is it a vocation to the good, or do we see a distinction between the good and the true? So there may be no modern prince, but there's the continuing need to decide in terms of the direction in which we wish to head. I don't see that we have much choice. The tactical choice of whether you do better serving on a governmental commission or do better giving advice to some organization that's on the outside picketing the governmental commission, that I don't think I can make a general answer to. That really very much depends on the immediate situation, and I can respect people's I mean, it's not clear-cut, and therefore I can respect people saying, well, it's better to serve on the commission and try to change the report that they give, or it's better to be outside with the picket sign. That depends. And maybe some people even do both. So that I think is quite a trick. But anyway, but I think we can't define it in the way that positivistic social science wanted to define it, which is that we are essentially technicians whose results are true, and then they get used for good or ill by somebody else, including us as the somebody else when we are, quote, citizens. I really think that's A, fooling yourself, and B, a dangerous doctrine because it's a way of fooling other people. Marcel.
Okay. We all agree that sociologists have social or political responsibilities, but there is a paradox. On one side, we often use the word globalization, so on and so on. Everything is global, international. But on the other side, we don't have still elaborative reflection on our political role on the global arena, or the international level. What can we do at the international level as a member of an international scientific community? And it's not only the question of North Africa, Algeria, and so on, but there are many problems, and it's impossible for us as member of an international community, of an international network, to do something. And I'm trying to organize a session on this issue during the next IIC conference, and when I speak about this to my colleagues from different countries, I get always the same response. It's not the role of the IIC, etc., etc. That's true. But I think that we need to have a discussion on this issue. So, because we speak about everything in general, but what can we do as a member of an international network? We need a tribune, we need a forum, we need something. So if you have an idea about this next conference, next session, give you a name, idea, something else.
You've raised a question which has been omitted in this discussion. We've been talking of the sociologist as the individual making an individual choice, and now you're asking the question, which is a perfectly legitimate question, do our collective structures, sociological associations, whether at the national or international level, also have a choice to make? And I invite comments on that. Chalar.
Well, Emmanuel, you talked about a spectrum of liberal states versus less liberal, and then Janet talked about resource, more resource, less resource. Supposedly these dimensions would explain why sociologists find themselves in different situations in less developed and more developed countries. But there is also something which has not been perhaps emphasized, which is the different professionalization of the sociologists. I mean, I suspect that the average sociologist in North America never finds himself or herself in a position to make a public statement, because the pressures of tailorization that Ari talked about are so great. And the usual tendency is to write articles in journals that only other sociologists read. The sociologist is no longer a public intellectual, as far as I can see, and in fact, this has been, of course, written about much, the sort of fall of the public intellectual, and therefore not dangerous. But there is a real difference, I think, with countries like Abdul was talking about, or Partha was talking about, where the sociologist is still in the role of an intellectual at large and is expected to comment on things and is forced to comment on things. I'm not trying to idolize the situation because it is also full of problems, especially I find that in that sort of medium range of transition, if you wish, along with the impact of globalization. There is now a demand not so much to comment on issues in a really engaged manner at length and in order to emancipate and educate and provide critical perspective, but more and more the commentary is to reduce to sound bites, because newspapers and the multiplicity of television channels, they all seem to want sort of digestible commentary from intellectuals who are engaged in some fashion. And I see this certainly in Turkey, but I assume in other places as well, that this pressure to provide these digestible commentaries is in fact leading towards situations that Janet deplored of perhaps doing harm, because those comments can never be as thought out and as measured as you would like them to be. So the very different pressures of professionalization, I think, obtain.
Yeah. The danger of being interviewed is what you're talking about. Especially by a journalist who isn't really well informed about what you're doing. That becomes very, very dangerous, yes.
And also it's time bound, 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And
well, 30 seconds.
But in any case, if it's a newspaper journalist, you don't even know what
he makes orders. What he makes a lot of
Well, Joran.
Much of the discussion so far, I mean, has focused on ethical aspects of the position of sociologists and sociology in society, and that's of course something quite proper and quite legitimate. But there are also, of course, cognitive issues which we should perhaps also address. Let me start by a reflection I made when I listened to Marcel about sort of the international community and what can be done. I mean, and there is, of course, one social science which has become enormously influential, not only on a national level, but very much exactly on a global level, with a common sort of global education and basically a common global training, global experience, and held together by a very extended, really sort of global network. And that's of course economics, and all these US economics departments trained, educated, World Bank trained economists who then become ministers of finance in Brazil, in Peru, in Malaysia, in well, lots of all over the world and so on, and or in Poland. I mean, Balcerowicz is one of those people who has actually written about this, and the power and the power to intervene in not in necessarily in situations of what Dimon would call acute conflict, but what Balcerowicz would call exceptional situations in which this kind of non-elected economist politicians make their interventions, and as they are not they're accountable to and not dependent upon the electorate. It doesn't matter whether, I mean, their policies are popular or not, or whether they hurt people or not, because I mean they are basically evaluated by their peers in the World Bank and in the departments of economics. Now that's, I mean, if there is some way in which, I mean, a professional social science could operate on an international level in an effective way. I mean, that's one way. I mean, and actually the only existing successful way with this combination of a common education, common training, and an extensive network of various sorts. Whether that's something which is even desirable, I mean, for people with other views than neoliberal economics, I'm not quite sure. I'm not a speaker whether it's possible, but at least it raises the issue of the power of sociology and the power of the knowledge, or the capacity, the force of the knowledge we are producing. I've been coming from a much less dramatic part of the world than many of my colleagues here. I've been quite impressed by the assumption you have about the power of sociology. I mean, it may not be as powerful as the real powers, or as the ruling class, as we said in the old days. But nevertheless, I mean, there seems to be an assumption that sociologists are very powerful, and what I do and what I don't, I mean, really matters not only as a moral thing, but also in the real world. And I'm not quite so sure whether, at least I mean in the part of marginal power, peripheral part of the world I come from, it's I don't think we can claim to have the capacity to do very much. There seems to be, if we look at northwestern Europe, there seems to be a problem here with the sociological role in society, in the sense that, on the one hand, many sociologists are very interested in interpreting society. This is a great deal of what contemporary sociological theory is about, various concepts of risk society, modernity, second modernity, reflexive modernity, postmodernism, what have you. In some cases, I mean, sociologists producing and selling these interpretations have been actually quite influential. I mean, in public opinion and intellectual media, and they are sort of competing quite successfully with some of the other newspaper commentators, and they basically operate on that level. But there is a problem here. The problem is that it's only a few of them, I mean, who really matters, and all the others who are dabbling in this trade are sort of drawing ridicule on the whole discipline. I mean, this is why both The Guardian and The Zeit and lots of other papers, I mean, can poke fun at sociology and all this kind of amateur theorists, because, I mean, these interpretations are usually not based on any production of knowledge. I mean, that's there are some people, I mean, who have a certain intuitive sense of what's going on, and kind of a sense of the times, and feeling the wind and so on, and they can express it. But on the more routine sociology is trying to do that. I mean, it simply looks very limited, I mean, to put it mildly. So this is one of the problems. I mean, the production of knowledge and the bifurcation between interpretative influence, and on the other hand, the production of knowledge. And I think that I think this is one of the major problems for sociology's position in society, at least for a good part of the world. I mean, and it's perhaps particularly acute. I mean, in northwestern Europe. I mean, say in Germany, in the UK, and in the Scandinavian countries, and this is where these issues are discussed in these ways. And there are certain special areas in which sociologists have established themselves as reliable producers of and respectable producers of knowledge, but in many other areas, I mean, that position is being lost, undermined, or challenged, and not very well defended. And this also raises the question of the sociologist position in Eastern Europe, where there is a growth in sociology, and very much kind of sociology which operates as a recording of society, as you put it, particularly but very predominantly in the very special, very limited, and in my opinion rather narrow format of opinion polling. And once this becomes routine, and it is becoming routine, and it's being regularly paid for by Western fund agencies, all this kind of opinion polling about what people think about this or that, I mean, can be, you don't need, I mean, much sociology, and hardly even sociologists, or very trained sociologists to do this. I mean, once it become a kind of routine machine, and that's something which in the medium run will considerably weaken, I mean, the position of social science or sociology in many countries, at least in Eastern Europe. I think I'll stop here. So the main point is this. I mean, I think we also should think of our cognitive vocation, which Arit also mentioned earlier, and what can be done about this and what should be done about it.
Okay, we're running out of time. Linda?
Yes, in summing up one part of the conversation, Emmanuel described power relations up. And I would just wanted to make sure that we didn't leave without also pointing to power relationships down, so to speak, and a commitment that I see that a lot of sociologists have to ensuring that the most marginalized in the society are given voice and are able to sort of understand social structures as part of a commitment to create social change. Now, I realize that that's not that sort of being very visible in that role, like I am in Nova Scotia in terms of working with particular marginalized groups, and as an active feminist, and who, I think probably more than a lot of people who've described their role here, I tend to be more I tend to do a passionate, engaged type of scholarship. And what I have discovered is that I learn more that way. In other words, I have a broader range of knowledge of the society and of the power relationships in the society when I do engage in that sort of passionate, sort of engaged, attempting to change structures than I do if I simply am in my sort of office reflecting on things and reading theories where I don't fit anyway. So, I think it really does depend. I agree with people here who've said we really can't, we're not trying to find a prescription that works for everyone, but in fact one that works where people are in their sets of social relationships, getting back to Janet's sort of cross and sort of our location that she mentioned earlier on. I also think that it's important, to or I guess I wanted to get back to the point that Emmanuel also raised in terms of what about our social science organizations. And I do think that we have a real role to play there. Certainly feminist sociologists in Canada have played that role within groups called the Social Science Federation of Canada, within discipline organizations, within, and I would hope that we would play some of that role within the International Sociological Association. I think
that's a role within the association. What about the role of the association within the
within the world? And I think that there are times when it's important that the association play that role within the world as well, especially in terms of worrying about our social responsibilities to the poor, the marginalized, the people in countries who currently need us to act in solidarity with them and as allies with them. And I also think it's important for us to recognize what's happening to our profession at this time, and to begin to speak out about some of the intellectual property things that are going on, some of those issues which very much impact on ourselves as scholars and are likely to make it impossible for us to do our work in the future. Even in Canada, some of the new ethics debates are very, very worrisome in terms of allowing people in power to basically decide that work, and allowing our university presidents to decide that our work is not legitimate, ethically legitimate, and therefore needs to be stopped. And I think that to put that in our own ethical code is really very, very problematic in terms of what it might mean for critical scholarship in the future.
Thank you. Soo-Hoon?
Oh, yes, briefly, in total agreement with Charlotte Cater's comments that I think in Korea too, and also East Asian countries, there is now, because of perhaps this change, globalization, perhaps a tremendous space and demand and opportunity for sociologists, at last, to get invited and to write on newspapers and commentaries and to appear on TV and do all kinds of digestible commentaries. And there are those sociologists who say, no, we're not supposed to do that. We're not going to write commentaries, columns on TV. We're not going to appear on newspapers. We're not going to appear on TV. Perhaps because of the unintended consequences, perhaps because of the worries about the harms. And I think that's very naive posture at this stage of our level of development. I don't know how to put it. If we don't do it, if say a decent socialists don't do it, the dilemma is that somebody else
will do it.
That
do it less well. And do it less well.
Precisely. Somebody else will do, and somebody else who primarily are already powerful amongst us, amongst the social scientists. Political scientists will do, and economists will do. And they indeed do, and they do write and talk on newspapers and TVs and radios, primarily promoting the predominant, prevailing discourse and ideology. There is neoliberal, neoclassical kind of, ideas. So I think we have to be very active in that sense. I have no problem with serving on the government commission, be it environment, be it anything else, consumer. I mean, how do we know what will be the consequences? The consequences can be very short-term, mid-term, long-term. It will serve some purposes. The purpose may be bad in the short term, it will be good in the mid-term, it will be very good in the long term. So nobody really can assess the consequences, the harm. So perhaps what I'm trying to say is that better do it than not do it.
Okay, and on that advice, perhaps we'll close, but I would like to note that in this discussion, everyone just about has taken the position that yes, the sociologist is inevitably involved in her society, state, and ought to be involved, but you're all prudent. That is to say, you're all suggesting that it's not so easy, and that one can make mistakes that are very grave, and nobody has come down with a clear, certain line of how to do this. Everyone is saying yes, but maybe, but yes, but maybe, etc. And I think that reflects indeed the state of our collective thinking in the 1990s, perhaps in the 1960s, or the tone of our discussion might have been somewhat different. And yes, it is true that probably other groups of social scientists, the tone might be somewhat different. A lot of discussion has been held about the economists. We haven't talked about historians or anthropologists or all sorts of other people who have this kind of discussion in various ways. And I don't think we should turn this into a comparative analysis of different varieties of social scientists, because the problem is, of course, a generic one, even if it's loaded a little more in one direction or another bias. So there we are. We think we should be engaged in some way, in some form, but we're not totally sure what that way is or what that form is in the abstract, although many of us think we can answer that question in concrete circumstances. So I thank you for this discussion, and I thank you for the discussion we've had now for 2 days, which I think has been an extremely fruitful one. And call this